The billionaire was about to sign bankruptcy papers when a black waitress spotted a crucial mistake. The private dining room at Luminous Restaurant in Miami's Wynwood Arts District was silent except for the scratch of a pen. Richard Chambers sat at the head of a mahogany table, his tailored suit hanging loose on a frame that had lost 40 pounds in the past 6 months. He was a billionaire in freefall. His real estate empire had collapsed. His tech ventures had imploded. His partnerships had crumbled. And now, in 5 minutes, he would sign away everything: his company, his properties, his dignity. Before him lay the bankruptcy papers. Thick. Legal. Final. "Just sign here, Richard," his CFO Gregory Hayes said, pointing to the signature line. Gregory had been his friend since childhood. Gregory had been with him through every triumph. And Gregory was about to watch him lose it all. Or so Richard thought. Richard reached for the pen. His hand was shaking. He hadn't slept in 3 days. He hadn't eaten. He couldn't remember the last time he felt anything but despair. "Wait," he said, his voice hoarse. "Let me read through this one more time." "There's no time," Gregory said firmly. "The court deadline is tomorrow. If you don't sign tonight, you lose the protective order. The creditors will come after you personally. You'll lose everything anyway, but worse. You need to sign." Richard nodded numbly. Gregory was right. There was no point in reading. The damage was done. His companies were worthless. His assets were frozen. His reputation was destroyed. What did it matter what the papers said? He picked up the pen again. That's when Tanya Brooks appeared at the doorway, carrying a tray of champagne flutes. She was a waitress at Luminous. She had been bringing food and drinks to the private dining room all evening, invisible to the men making decisions about wealth and power. But Tanya wasn't invisible. Not really. She was watching. She was listening. And most importantly, she was reading. She had spotted the documents on the table when she cleared the appetizer plates. And as she set down the champagne, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A hidden clause. Buried on page 17. Designed to transfer Richard's remaining assets, not to creditors, but to a shell corporation called Pinnacle Holdings LLC. She had seen that corporation name before. It was registered to Gregory Hayes. Gregory wasn't helping Richard through bankruptcy. He was orchestrating his complete financial destruction so he could steal what remained. Tanya had 2 seconds to decide. Say nothing, and watch a man lose everything to fraud. Or speak up, risk her job, and potentially make enemies of powerful people. She set down the champagne tray with shaking hands. What Richard didn't know was that Gregory had been planning this for 10 years. What Gregory didn't anticipate was that a black waitress with a high school education and a wounded heart would be the one to stop him. And what Tanya was about to discover was that her mother's death 10 years ago wasn't just bad luck. It was directly connected to the man sitting across from Richard, smiling like a trusted friend. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. May today bring you joy and blessings. Now, let's begin. 6 months earlier, Richard Chambers was the king of Miami. His real estate portfolio spanned 3 states. His tech company, Chambers Digital, was valued at $3.2 billion. He had penthouse views of Biscayne Bay. He had cars that cost more than houses. He had power that seemed absolute and unshakable. But he also had Gregory Hayes as his CFO. Gregory had been Richard's closest friend and business partner for 12 years. They had met in college, 2 ambitious young men from humble backgrounds determined to conquer the world. Richard had the vision and charisma. Gregory had the analytical mind and financial expertise. Together, they had built an empire that dominated Miami's business landscape. But Gregory harbored a secret. A dark secret that had been festering in his heart for exactly 10 years. 10 years ago, Richard had fired an employee named Margaret Brooks. She was a junior accountant in the finance department. She was hardworking, dedicated, and beloved by her co-workers. Gregory had personally recommended her termination. He had presented Richard with evidence of theft, documents showing that Margaret had been stealing company funds. Richard had trusted Gregory completely. He had signed the termination papers without conducting an independent investigation. What Richard never discovered was the truth. Margaret Brooks wasn't stealing anything. Gregory was. Gregory had been systematically embezzling from the company for years. When the audits started getting closer to discovering his crimes, Gregory needed a scapegoat. Margaret was perfect. She was new. She was a junior. She was expendable. Gregory had fabricated evidence against her. He had falsified documents. He had destroyed her career and her reputation in a single afternoon. Margaret Brooks lost her job that day. She lost her apartment 2 months later. She lost her health insurance. She lost her dignity and her hope. And 6 months after being fired, Margaret Brooks suffered a massive stress-induced heart attack and died, leaving behind a 12-year-old daughter named Tanya who suddenly had to grow up overnight. Gregory had never confessed. Gregory had never felt remorse. But 3 months ago, everything changed. 3 months ago, Richard's carefully constructed empire began to crumble. His real estate investments, which should have appreciated steadily, suddenly started losing value. Properties in prime locations sat vacant. Deals that were supposed to close inexplicably fell through. Contracts that were locked in with major corporations suddenly dissolved without explanation. Financing for new projects vanished overnight. Richard couldn't understand it. He blamed the changing market. He blamed economic downturns. He blamed his investors for being cowardly. He blamed everyone except the one person who was actually responsible. Gregory Hayes was systematically destroying Richard's business from the inside. For 10 years, Gregory had waited for the right moment to exact his revenge. He had watched Richard succeed while he remained in the background, managing finances and handling logistics. He had watched Richard get credit for successes that Gregory had engineered. He had watched Richard live a luxurious life while Gregory remained, in his mind, underappreciated and overlooked. But the real catalyst for Gregory's actions was something simpler and darker. Pure jealousy mixed with the need for revenge against someone who had allowed an innocent woman to be destroyed in order to protect a guilty man. Gregory began his sabotage slowly and carefully. He redirected funds to hidden accounts. He manipulated contracts with subtle changes that would take months to discover. He leaked confidential business information to Richard's competitors. He orchestrated the failure of key partnerships. And he did it all with such precision that Richard would never suspect his oldest friend. By the time Richard realized something was deeply wrong, it was too late. The damage was catastrophic and irreversible. Tanya Brooks, meanwhile, had been working at Luminous Restaurant in Miami's Wynwood Arts District for exactly 2 years. She was 22 years old. She was brilliant, observant, and hungry to understand how the world of business and power operated. She had earned a full scholarship to Florida International University, where she was studying business administration and accounting. She worked nights at the restaurant to pay for living expenses and to support her younger brother who was still in high school. Her co-workers at Luminous didn't know her full story. They saw a quiet black girl who moved efficiently through the dining room, who cleared tables with precision, who took orders with patience, who smiled at wealthy customers even when they treated her like she was invisible. They saw her surface. They didn't see her mind. What her co-workers didn't know was that Tanya was constantly learning. She was absorbing lessons about business by observing how wealthy people conducted their transactions. She was studying contract language by reading documents that careless clients left on tables. She was understanding power dynamics by watching how money moved through rooms and how decisions were made when people assumed service workers couldn't hear them or understand them. One night, approximately 6 months ago, a customer had left behind a leather portfolio containing Richard Chambers' financial statements and business documents. Tanya had nearly thrown the folder away as she was cleaning the table. Instead, something made her pause. Instead, she opened it. Instead, she read it. What she found alarmed her. The numbers didn't make sense. Richard's assets were disappearing at an accelerating rate, but not due to market downturns or failed investments. The losses were systematic. They were deliberate. Someone with access to Richard's accounts and authority over his business decisions was systematically transferring funds and liquidating assets. Tanya recognized it immediately. Embezzlement. She had read enough accounting textbooks to understand what she was looking at. She had studied enough financial reports to recognize the pattern. Someone was stealing from Richard Chambers, and they were doing it with sophistication and care. Tanya should have reported what she found. She should have contacted the authorities or Richard's company directly. Instead, she kept quiet. Because Tanya had a reason to not care about Richard Chambers' fate. Tanya had a reason to believe that wealthy people deserved whatever consequences came to them. Tanya had a reason to feel nothing but indifference when she saw a billionaire losing his empire. Her reason was named Margaret Brooks. Her reason was her mother. 10 years ago, when Tanya was 12 years old, everything changed. Her mother Margaret came home from work one afternoon and told Tanya that she had been fired. She had been accused of stealing from her employer. She insisted that the accusation was false, that she had done nothing wrong, that there had been some terrible mistake. But nobody listened to Margaret Brooks. Nobody investigated. Nobody cared about the truth. Within days, her reputation was destroyed. Within weeks, she lost her apartment. Within months, she lost her will to fight. Tanya remembered her mother lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, not eating, not sleeping, not living. Tanya remembered the day the ambulance came. Tanya remembered the hospital. Tanya remembered the moment when the doctors told her that her mother's heart had simply stopped. Tanya had spent 10 years carrying that grief. She had spent 10 years working to support herself and her brother. She had spent 10 years trying to understand why the world was so cruel, why good people suffered, why nobody ever held powerful people accountable for their actions. And then, 2 years ago, she recognized the man. Gregory Hayes walked into Luminous Restaurant on a Tuesday evening. He was meeting with a client. He was laughing about something. He looked successful and happy and completely unburdened by guilt. Tanya had found an old photo of her mother's company ID badge in a box of her mother's belongings. The photo showed her mother standing next to her manager, a man named Gregory Hayes. The photo was labeled in her mother's handwriting, "Margaret and Gregory, the dream team." Tanya had done research. She had found articles about her mother's death in the local newspaper archives. She had found her mother's obituary. She had pieced together the timeline. And she had reached a conclusion that felt impossible and true. Gregory Hayes had been responsible for her mother's firing. Gregory Hayes had somehow orchestrated her mother's destruction. And Gregory Hayes had never faced any consequences. For 2 years, Tanya had watched Gregory Hayes come in and out of the restaurant. For 2 years, she had served him drinks and cleared his plates and listened to his conversations. For 2 years, she had wanted to confront him, to expose him, to make him understand what he had done. But she had never done it. Because what would be the point? The statute of limitations had probably passed. There was no proof. There was no way to prove that Gregory Hayes had framed her mother for a crime she didn't commit. So Tanya had learned to live with the injustice. She had learned to move through her life carrying the weight of unanswered questions and unavenged wrongs. Now, 6 months ago, something unexpected happened. Richard Chambers came to Luminous Restaurant for a series of business meetings. He came alone. He came with documents. And he came looking increasingly desperate and lost. Tanya recognized him from the financial statements she had found. She watched him carefully as he conducted his business. She observed the way he deferred to Gregory. She noticed the way Gregory seemed to have complete control over every decision. And she began to understand that Gregory Hayes was destroying Richard Chambers with the same calculated precision that he had destroyed her mother. Richard was at his lowest point. He sat in his penthouse, the only property he still owned, and stared out at the Miami skyline that had once felt like his personal kingdom. Everything was collapsing around him. His lawyers had made it clear that bankruptcy was inevitable. There was no escaping it. There was no way to salvage his empire. "You have 2 realistic options," his attorney James had told him that afternoon in a conference room. "File for bankruptcy and try to salvage what assets you can. Or fight this in court for years, spend hundreds of thousands in legal fees, and lose everything anyway while your reputation gets destroyed in the process. Either way, you lose. The only question is which way hurts less." Richard had listened to the options and felt nothing but despair. There was no winning scenario. There was only choosing which method of losing felt most bearable. He picked up a bottle of scotch and poured himself a drink. He thought about jumping off the balcony. He thought about driving his car into the ocean at high speed. He thought about simply disappearing and starting over somewhere nobody knew him or his name. Then his phone rang. It was Gregory. "Richard, we need to finalize the bankruptcy paperwork tonight," Gregory said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "The court deadline is tomorrow morning. I've prepared all the necessary documents. Everything will be handled properly. I promise you, this will protect you as much as possible. We'll get through this together." Richard felt something break inside him. Gregory was the only person he trusted completely. Gregory was his oldest friend. Gregory had been there through everything, every success and every failure. "I don't know if I can do this," Richard said, his voice cracking with emotion. "You can," Gregory said firmly. "And I'll be there with you every step of the way. That's what friends do. We support each other in our darkest moments." Richard hung up the phone. He believed Gregory completely. He believed that his oldest friend would help him navigate this disaster and protect him through the bankruptcy process. What Richard didn't know was that Gregory's betrayal ran far deeper than simple embezzlement. What Gregory didn't anticipate was that his carefully constructed fraud would leave digital traces that a federal investigator would eventually discover. And what neither of them knew was that a waitress with a broken heart and a sharp accounting mind was about to become the most important witness in a case that would expose decades of corruption and greed. The evening of the bankruptcy signing arrived with the weight of finality. Richard dressed in a dark suit, the same suit he had worn to board meetings and business dinners when he was still a billionaire. He looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the man staring back. His face was gaunt. His eyes were hollow. His skin had a grayish pallor that suggested someone who hadn't slept in weeks. He drove to Luminous Restaurant in his last remaining car, a Range Rover that Gregory had assured him would not be seized in the bankruptcy proceedings. Richard wasn't even sure if that was true anymore. He didn't trust anything he had been told. The restaurant was quiet when he arrived. It was a Tuesday evening, and the Wynwood Arts District was relatively empty. Richard took the private elevator to the second floor where the private dining room was located. The room was designed for exactly this kind of meeting: confidential, exclusive, hidden from prying eyes. His attorney James was already there, looking uncomfortable and sympathetic. Gregory was there too, wearing an expression of concerned friendship that Richard had come to depend on. On the mahogany table before them sat the bankruptcy documents in a leather folder. The papers looked official. They looked final. They looked like the end of everything Richard had built. "Thank you for meeting us here, Richard," James said, gesturing to a chair. "I know this is difficult." Richard sat down heavily. He felt like a man walking to his own execution. Gregory smiled at him, a smile that was meant to be reassuring but that Richard, for just a moment, found oddly predatory. "We're going to get through this, Richard. I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but this bankruptcy is actually the best outcome given the circumstances. Once you sign these papers, the court will offer you protection. The creditors can't touch you personally. Your remaining assets will be carefully distributed according to bankruptcy law. You'll have a chance to start over." Richard nodded, grateful for Gregory's words but unable to shake a strange sense of unease that he couldn't quite explain. Tanya had volunteered to work the private dining room that evening. Her supervisor had been surprised by the request. Tanya usually preferred to work the main dining room where the tips were better and the shifts were more predictable. But Tanya had insisted. She had a feeling, an intuition, a sense that something important was going to happen. She had spent the last 6 months watching Richard's decline. She had observed him coming to the restaurant with increasingly desperate expressions. She had noticed the way his hands shook when he reviewed documents. She had seen the deterioration of a powerful man being systematically destroyed. And she had noticed that Gregory Hayes was always there in the background, smiling, offering advice, playing the role of loyal friend and trusted advisor. Tanya had done more research. She had spent hours in the public library using the free computers to investigate Gregory Hayes' financial records. She had found the Shell Corporation, Pinnacle Holdings LLC, registered to him. She had found the property transfers and the business dealings and the way money moved through his accounts in suspicious patterns. She had even hired a private investigator with money she could barely afford to spend. The investigator had confirmed her suspicions. Gregory Hayes was engaged in systematic fraud. The details were complex, but the conclusion was clear. Gregory was stealing from Richard Chambers. And tonight, according to the reservation, Richard was meeting with his attorney and Gregory in the private dining room. Tonight, based on the fragments of conversation Tanya had overheard, Richard was going to sign bankruptcy papers. Tanya entered the private dining room carrying a tray with water glasses and appetizers. She moved quietly, invisibly, the way she had learned to move through spaces where her presence was neither welcomed nor acknowledged. "Good evening, gentlemen," she said, setting down the plates. "We have a lovely special this evening, pan-seared sea bass with—" "That sounds wonderful," Gregory interrupted, waving her away with his hand. "We'll have whatever you recommend. No need to consult us further." Tanya nodded and turned to leave. But as she did, her eye caught something on the table. The leather folder containing the bankruptcy papers had fallen slightly open. Visible was a document with Richard's name on it and language about asset transfer and shell corporations. Tanya paused. Just for a moment. Just long enough to read the visible text on page 17. Asset transfer agreement. All remaining personal and corporate assets of Richard Chambers shall be transferred to Pinnacle Holdings LLC within 30 days of bankruptcy approval. Tanya's heart stopped. She knew what Pinnacle Holdings LLC was. She had researched it for months. It was Gregory Hayes' shell corporation. It was the vehicle through which he was stealing Richard's remaining wealth. The bankruptcy papers weren't protecting Richard. They were designed to transfer everything he had left directly into Gregory's possession under the guise of legal bankruptcy proceedings. Tanya walked out of the private dining room on shaking legs. She went to the Kit Phillips and leaned against the counter, trying to process what she had just seen. She had a choice in front of her. She could say nothing. She could pretend she had seen nothing. She could let Richard Chambers sign away his remaining assets to the man who was stealing from him. Part of her wanted to do exactly that. Part of her wanted justice, even if it came in a form that was itself unjust. Part of her wanted to see Richard suffer the way her mother had suffered. But another part of her, a part that sounded like her mother's voice, whispered, "Tanya, do the right thing. Not for him. For yourself. Because you'll have to live with this choice for the rest of your life." Tanya took a breath. She steadied her hands. And she made a decision that would change everything. She found the restaurant manager and told him she needed a 15-minute break. She went to the back office and opened her laptop. She searched for the contact information for Richard Chambers' attorney, not Gregory, but the other attorney, James Mitchell, whose name she had seen on the documents. Her hands were shaking as she typed out an email. "Mr. Mitchell, my name is Tanya Brooks. I work as a server at Luminous Restaurant in Wynwood. I have discovered evidence of potential fraud in the bankruptcy documents that Richard Chambers is about to sign. The documents appear to contain a hidden clause that will transfer his remaining assets to a shell corporation owned by Gregory Hayes, rather than to creditors as the bankruptcy process requires. I have attached images of the relevant pages. I can provide additional documentation if needed. This requires your immediate attention. Tanya Brooks." She attached the photos of the documents that she had taken weeks ago when she first started researching Gregory. She hit send. Her finger moved away from the keyboard and she sat back, realizing what she had just done. She had just betrayed a man who might deserve betrayal. She had just helped someone who had no reason to help her. She had just chosen integrity over revenge. Her phone buzzed immediately. An email from James Mitchell. "Ms. Brooks, I am calling emergency proceedings. Do not allow Mr. Chambers to sign anything. I am on my way to the restaurant. Please keep those documents safe." Tanya's phone rang 30 seconds later. It was James. "Ms. Brooks, I need you to listen to me very carefully. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk into that private dining room and I'm going to stop Richard from signing those papers. When I do, there will be chaos. There will be accusations. Gregory will almost certainly deny everything. But I need you to be a witness. I need you to testify that you saw these documents. I need you to explain how you obtained the photographs. Can you do that? Tanya nodded, then realized he couldn't see her nod. Yes, she said. I can do that. Thank you, James said. Thank you for doing the right thing. Your mother would be proud of you. Those words hit Tanya like a physical blow. How did James Mitchell know about her mother? How did he know that her mother had died? What did he know? I didn't know your mother, James continued, as if reading her mind, but I know her story. I know that she was fired unfairly from a company called Chambers Digital. I know that the firing was orchestrated by Gregory Hayes. I know that she died shortly after. And I know that you have been carrying this burden alone for 10 years. What you just did, what you just risked, that took tremendous courage. Your mother's death might finally lead to justice. Real justice. Justice that holds Gregory accountable instead of Richard. The line went dead. Tanya stood in the back office of Luminous Restaurant with her laptop open and her heart pounding. She walked back out to the dining room. She returned to the private dining room where Richard, James, and Gregory were still sitting. She served them their appetizers with steady hands. Everything okay? Gregory asked, studying her face. Everything is fine, Tanya said, meeting his eyes. Just fine. Richard was picking at the food, looking more distressed than before. He kept glancing toward the leather folder containing the bankruptcy papers. I think we should sign these, Richard said quietly. I'm ready to move forward. I'm ready to accept the consequences of my failures. Actually, Richard, I need to discuss something with you before we proceed, James said, his voice careful and controlled. He pulled out his phone and showed Richard the photographs of the bankruptcy documents. Richard's face went pale. Those documents, James continued, contain a clause that is not standard in bankruptcy proceedings. This clause directs all your remaining assets to a shell corporation registered to Gregory Hayes. This is not protection. This is theft. This is fraud. Gregory stood up abruptly. His face flushed red with anger. This is ridiculous. Those documents are legitimate. That clause is standard. James, you're being hysterical. I'm being thorough, James replied calmly. And I'm calling the FBI. I'm calling federal prosecutors. And I'm telling them that you have committed systematic fraud against your business partner and oldest friend. Gregory looked at Richard. For a moment, his carefully constructed mask of friendship slipped. For a moment, Richard saw the truth in Gregory's eyes. The hatred, the resentment, the premeditated malice. Richard understood in that moment that Gregory had orchestrated everything. Not just the recent bankruptcy fraud, but everything. The failures. The collapsed deals. The disappearing assets. All of it had been Gregory's careful, patient revenge. Why? Richard asked, his voice barely a whisper. Gregory smiled. It was the smile of a man who had finally won something after waiting 10 years. Because Margaret Brooks deserved better, Gregory said. Because her daughter deserved better. And because you trusted me to handle her firing without asking questions. You let me destroy an innocent woman, and you never even cared enough to investigate. You just signed the papers and moved on with your life. What Gregory didn't know was that his confession had just been recorded by the restaurant security system. What Richard didn't anticipate was that federal prosecutors were already investigating him based on evidence that would be discovered in Gregory's accounts. And what Tanya finally understood was that her mother's death, while tragic and unjust, was going to lead to real accountability. But the question remained, would exposing Gregory's crimes also expose Richard's complicity in what had happened to Margaret Brooks all those years ago? The private dining room at Luminous erupted into chaos. Gregory lunged toward the door, but James blocked his path. Richard sat frozen in his chair, trying to process what had just been revealed. Tanya stood in the corner, still holding the appetizer tray, a silent witness to everything. Don't move, James said, his phone already dialing 911. Federal agents are on their way. You're not leaving this restaurant. Gregory's face twisted with rage. This is entrapment. This is a setup. You have no right. I have every right, James interrupted, his voice steady and authoritative. You confessed to systematic fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. You confessed to framing an innocent woman. And you did it all in front of a witness and on a restaurant security camera system. It's over, Gregory. The police arrived in less than 10 minutes. Federal agents came shortly after. The private dining room was sealed as a crime scene. Tanya was asked to give a statement to the federal investigators. She sat in a small office off the main dining room and told them everything. She told them about discovering the financial inconsistencies in Richard's statements. She told them about recognizing Gregory as her mother's former manager. She told them about researching Pinnacle Holdings LLC. She told them about the photographs of the fraudulent bankruptcy documents. She told them about emailing James Mitchell. The lead federal agent, a woman named Detective Sarah Phillips, listened carefully and took detailed notes. You understand, Detective Phillips said, that this information will likely be used in a criminal prosecution. You understand that you may be called to testify in court. You understand that Gregory Hayes' defense attorney will likely attempt to discredit you and your motivations. Are you prepared for that? Tanya nodded. I'm prepared. There's something else you should know, Detective Phillips said, closing her notebook. We've been investigating Gregory Hayes for 3 years. We suspected systematic fraud, but we couldn't prove it. We knew about the connection to Margaret Brooks. We knew about what happened to her. But we didn't have the evidence we needed. You just gave us that evidence. You might have just solved a case that could lead to federal prosecution on multiple counts. You did good work tonight. Richard Chambers sat alone in his penthouse the next morning. The story was already on the news. Billionaire CEO saved from fraud by Waitress. Fed agents arrest CFO in major embezzlement case. Shell Corporation scheme unraveled in Miami restaurant. Richard's phone had been ringing constantly. Creditors who suddenly wanted to renegotiate. Investors who smelled blood in the water. Reporters who wanted his side of the story. He ignored all of it. Instead, he sat at his Kit Phillips table with a cup of cold coffee and thought about everything that had happened. He thought about the bankruptcy papers he hadn't signed. He thought about the assets that Gregory had tried to steal. He thought about the confession that Gregory had made. Most of all, he thought about Margaret Brooks. He had done a quick search the night before and found her obituary from 10 years ago. He had read the brief biography. Margaret Brooks, 38, passed away from complications related to stress and cardiac arrest. She is survived by her daughter, Tanya Brooks, age 12, and her son, Marcus Brooks, age 8. Richard realized that the waitress who had saved him was Margaret Brooks' daughter. He realized that he had fired Margaret Brooks on Gregory's recommendation without investigating. He realized that Margaret had died shortly after being fired. He realized that Tanya had been 12 years old when she lost her mother. And he realized that Tanya had not exposed Gregory's fraud against Richard because she wanted to help Richard. She had exposed it because it was the right thing to do. Richard made a decision. He called his attorney. I want to hire the best private investigator money can buy. I want a complete investigation into Margaret Brooks' firing. I want to know exactly what happened, and I want to know what my role was. I don't care if the findings implicate me. I want the truth. The investigation took 3 months. What it revealed was both expected and devastating. Gregory had fabricated evidence of theft. Gregory had falsified documents. Gregory had manipulated Richard into firing Margaret without any legitimate cause. And Richard, in his arrogance, had never questioned Gregory's narrative. Richard had simply trusted his friend and signed the termination papers. Richard had been complicit in the destruction of Margaret Brooks' life through his negligence and his arrogance. When the investigation was complete, Richard did something unprecedented. He called a press conference. With his attorney standing beside him, Richard publicly apologized for his role in Margaret Brooks' firing. He explained what had happened. He acknowledged his responsibility. And he announced that he was establishing a $2 million memorial fund in Margaret Brooks' name, to be distributed to her surviving family members and to be used for educational scholarships for underprivileged students. The media reaction was mixed. Some praised Richard for his accountability. Others criticized him for trying to buy redemption. Some questioned whether his actions were genuine or simply a public relations strategy. Richard didn't care about the optics. He cared about something he had never cared about before: doing the right thing, regardless of the cost. Tanya watched the news conference from her apartment. She sat on the edge of her bed, her laptop open, watching Richard Chambers apologize for his role in her mother's destruction. She didn't know how to feel. Part of her wanted to dismiss it as performative. Part of her wanted to accept it as genuine. Part of her wondered if reconciliation was even possible when the damage had been so profound and so permanent. Her phone rang. It was James Mitchell. "Tanya, I wanted to call you before you heard it from anyone else. Richard wants to meet with you. He wants to discuss the memorial fund. He wants to make sure that his efforts to provide restitution are aligned with what you and your family actually need." "I don't think I can meet with him," Tanya said immediately. "I understand," James replied. "But I'm asking you to consider it. I'm asking you to consider the possibility that people can change. I'm asking you to consider that accountability, even when it comes late, is still valuable." Tanya hung up and sat in silence. That evening, her younger brother Marcus came home from school. Marcus was 18 now. He was about to graduate high school and attend college on his own scholarship. He was the child who had been 8 years old when their mother died. He was the child who remembered her the least. He was the child who had grown up carrying grief he didn't fully understand. Tanya told Marcus about Richard Chambers' apology. She told him about the memorial fund. She told him that Richard wanted to meet with them. "What do you want to do?" Marcus asked. "I don't know," Tanya admitted. "I spent 10 years hating him. I spent months watching him fall apart and feeling nothing but satisfaction. And then I helped save him from fraud. And now he's apologizing and offering money. I don't know how to process any of it." Marcus sat down beside his sister. "Maybe you don't have to process it all at once. Maybe you just have to decide what you need from him. Not what you're supposed to need. Not what makes sense. What you actually need." Tanya thought about that. She realized that what she needed was acknowledgement. She needed Richard to understand what her family had suffered. She needed him to take responsibility. She needed him to understand that money couldn't fix what had been broken. A week later, Tanya agreed to meet with Richard Chambers. The meeting took place in a small office building downtown, neutral territory where Tanya felt safe. Richard arrived alone, without his attorney, without any advisors. They sat across from each other at a small table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "I don't know where to start," Richard said finally. "I don't know what I could possibly say that would be adequate or sufficient or correct." "You could start with the truth," Tanya said. "You could explain why you fired my mother without investigating. You could explain why you trusted Gregory Hayes over your own judgment. You could explain why you never even noticed that she had died." Richard nodded slowly. "I fired your mother because Gregory told me to. I didn't investigate because I didn't want to know the truth. I trusted Gregory because it was easier than thinking critically about what he was telling me. And I never noticed that your mother had died because I was too focused on my own success to care about the people I had destroyed along the way." Tanya felt tears running down her face. Not because Richard's answer was perfect or healing, but because it was honest. "My mother was a good person," Tanya said quietly. "She loved her job. She loved helping people. She was working toward her CPA license. And she lost everything because of a lie that you believed without question." "I know," Richard said. "And I'm sorry. I'm more sorry than I can express. And I understand that my apology doesn't change anything. Your mother is still gone. You still lost her. You still had to grow up without her. And that loss is permanent and real and my fault." They talked for 2 hours. Richard answered every question Tanya asked. He explained his failures. He acknowledged his arrogance. He accepted responsibility without making excuses. And most importantly, he listened to Tanya describe what her mother's death had meant. He heard her grief. He witnessed her pain. And he didn't try to fix it or minimize it or make it about himself. When Tanya left the meeting, she didn't feel healed. But she felt something shifting. She felt like maybe, just maybe, accountability could matter. Maybe redemption was possible, even when it came too late to change the outcome. Pause for a moment. Comment what you think should happen next. Don't forget to subscribe and click the notification bell. Your voice matters. May your heart be guided with wisdom and courage. What Tanya didn't know was that Richard's meeting with her had been observed by federal prosecutors who were building a case not just against Gregory, but against systematic fraud in the entire real estate and tech industry. What Richard didn't anticipate was that his public apology and acceptance of responsibility would inspire other victims to come forward. And what Tanya was about to discover was that her mother's story wasn't unique. There were dozens of other employees who had been framed, fired, and destroyed by Gregory Hayes over the years. And they were all about to get justice. The federal investigation into Gregory Hayes expanded rapidly. Federal prosecutors, armed with Richard's cooperation and Tanya's evidence, began interviewing employees and former employees of Chambers Digital. What they discovered was systematic fraud spanning more than 20 years. Gregory Hayes hadn't just stolen from Richard. He had stolen from the company. He had stolen from employees. He had framed at least 7 people for crimes they didn't commit, resulting in wrongful terminations that destroyed lives and families. Margaret Brooks was only the first victim. There was also David Phillips, a software engineer who had been blamed for stealing proprietary code. There was Patricia Washington, a finance officer who had been fired for embezzlement she didn't commit. There was James Rodriguez, who had been accused of trading company secrets to competitors. All of them had been victims of Gregory's carefully constructed schemes. All of them had been destroyed by lies that Gregory had told to protect himself and his crimes. Federal prosecutors built a case with 47 counts of fraud, embezzlement, wire fraud, and conspiracy. They found evidence of offshore accounts. They discovered shell corporations. They uncovered a decade-long pattern of theft and deception. And Gregory Hayes, facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life in federal prison, made a choice. He would cooperate. He would confess to everything. He would testify against himself in exchange for a reduced sentence. At his sentencing hearing, Gregory stood before the judge and confessed to every crime. He described his motivations: jealousy, resentment, the belief that Richard didn't deserve his success. He described his methods: fabricating evidence, manipulating documents, manipulating Richard's trust. He described his victims, the people whose lives he had destroyed for personal profit and revenge. And then he looked directly at Richard Chambers and said words that would change everything: "I'm sorry. I know that's inadequate. I know it doesn't fix anything. But I spent 20 years destroying people because I was angry about my own failures. I made you all into my victims because I couldn't accept my own mediocrity. And I'm profoundly sorry." The impact of Gregory's confession rippled through Miami's business community. News outlets covered the story extensively. Business leaders questioned their own relationships with their CFOs and trusted advisors. Employees began to wonder whether the people they had been told were criminals were actually victims of fraud. Most importantly, the 7 wrongfully terminated employees came forward. David Phillips had spent the last 15 years working as a freelance programmer, his career and reputation destroyed. Patricia Washington had spent years in dead-end jobs, unable to get hired at legitimate companies because of the embezzlement charge on her record. James Rodriguez had struggled with depression and addiction in the aftermath of being fired for espionage he didn't commit. All of them had suffered. All of them deserved restitution. Richard Chambers, in a move that shocked his remaining business associates, committed to providing financial restitution to all of Gregory's victims. He worked with federal prosecutors to ensure that money seized from Gregory's accounts would be distributed equitably. He provided additional money from his own remaining personal assets. But he also did something more important: he advocated publicly for each victim. He told their stories. He acknowledged their suffering. He worked to restore their reputations and their dignity. David Phillips was hired as the chief technology officer of a new venture capital firm. Patricia Washington was offered a position as the director of finance for a non-profit that worked with formerly incarcerated people. James Rodriguez was given a grant to start his own consulting business. Each of them received more than just money. Each of them received acknowledgement. Each of them was seen as a human being who had been wronged, rather than as a criminal or a problem to be forgotten. But the most profound transformation was personal rather than professional. Richard Chambers underwent intensive therapy to understand his own complicity in the wrongdoing. He realized that his arrogance and his willingness to trust Gregory without question had enabled Gregory's crimes. He understood that wealth and power had insulated him from consequences and had made him careless about the impact of his decisions on other people. He made a decision: he would rebuild his life differently. He wouldn't rebuild his business empire. He wouldn't try to recapture his billionaire status. Instead, he would dedicate himself to systemic change. Richard founded the Chambers Institute for Ethical Business Practices. The institute trained young business leaders on how to recognize fraud, how to protect vulnerable employees, and how to create cultures of accountability rather than cultures of hierarchy and blind obedience. He also established the Margaret Brooks Memorial Scholarship for Business Ethics. The scholarship would provide full rides to college for 100 students per year who came from low-income backgrounds and demonstrated commitment to ethical business practices. The first scholarship recipient was Marcus Brooks, Tanya's younger brother, who had been accepted to Florida International University to study business administration. 18 months after Gregory Hayes' sentencing, 18 months during which Gregory would spend his life in federal prison paying for his crimes, a ceremony was held at Luminous Restaurant in Miami's Wynwood Arts District. The event was designed to publicly acknowledge all of Gregory's victims and to celebrate the restitution and restoration that had followed the exposure of his crimes. Richard Chambers stood at a podium in front of the gathered crowd. News cameras were set up. Reporters were present. The local mayor was there. Federal prosecutors were present. And most importantly, the victims were there. David Phillips, Patricia Washington, James Rodriguez, Margaret Brooks' extended family, and Tanya Brooks, who stood beside her brother Marcus, watching everything unfold. "I want to acknowledge something important," Richard said, his voice steady but emotional. "I didn't expose Gregory Hayes. I didn't stop the fraud. I didn't bring the victims justice. I was actively being victimized myself when I was saved by someone else's courage and integrity." Richard gestured toward Tanya. Tanya Brooks works as a server at this restaurant. She was the person who discovered the fraud. She was the person who had the courage to report it. She was the person who risked her job and her safety to do the right thing. And she did it not because she benefited from it, but because it was the right thing to do. The crowd applauded. Tanya felt tears running down her face. She had never wanted to be famous or celebrated. She had only wanted to do what was right. "I want to say something to each of the victims who are here," Richard continued. "I want to apologize for the role I played in your suffering through my negligence and my arrogance. I want to acknowledge that the money I'm providing is inadequate compensation for what you've endured. And I want to commit to something bigger. I'm committing to systemic change. I'm committing to ensuring that what happened to you doesn't happen to the next generation of employees." Richard then announced a new initiative. He was working with business schools across the country to implement mandatory ethics training based on the case of Gregory Hayes. Business students would learn about what happened. They would understand the human cost of fraud and corruption. They would be trained to recognize the warning signs of systematic deception. But the most surprising announcement came next. Richard revealed that he had been in ongoing discussions with Tanya Brooks about her future. Tanya had completed her degree at Florida International University with honors, graduating with a degree in business administration and accounting. She had exceptional grades. She had references from multiple professors. And most importantly, she had the lived experience of recognizing and reporting fraud. "I'm offering Tanya a position," Richard said, looking directly at her. "I'm offering her the role of Director of Investigations for the Chambers Institute for Ethical Business Practices. I'm offering her the position because she is qualified for it. I'm offering it because her experience has given her insights that most people never develop. And I'm offering it because the most important work we do should be led by people who understand, in their bones, why integrity matters." Tanya stood frozen. She hadn't expected this. They had discussed her future in their recent meetings, but Richard hadn't mentioned a job offer. "Tanya, I want you to know that you don't have to accept," Richard said. "You don't owe me anything. But I would be honored if you would consider bringing your gifts and your integrity to this work." Tanya looked at her brother. Marcus nodded at her, his face full of encouragement. She looked out at the crowd, at Richard, at the victims who had been restored and redeemed through her courage. And she said yes. The crowd erupted in applause. For the first time since her mother's death, Tanya felt like something broken might be able to be repaired. Not the loss itself. Not the years she had lost with her mother. But the injustice. The injustice could be addressed. And maybe, through her work, she could prevent other families from experiencing the same tragedy. What Tanya didn't know was that Gregory Hayes, from his prison cell, had requested a meeting with her. What Richard didn't anticipate was that Tanya would want to speak directly with Gregory about his crimes and his victims. And what federal prosecutors didn't expect was that Gregory's cooperation would extend so far that he would help federal authorities uncover an even larger network of fraud extending beyond Chambers Digital into other companies across Miami and across the country. The exposure of Gregory's crimes was only the beginning. A systemic investigation into corruption in Florida's business community was about to begin. 3 years after Gregory Hayes' sentencing, Tanya Brooks sat in an office on the 23rd floor of a Miami high-rise building. The nameplate on her door read, "Tanya Brooks, Director of Investigations, Chambers Institute for Ethical Business Practices." She was 25 years old. She had a degree in business administration and accounting. She had 3 years of professional experience uncovering fraud and training business leaders on ethical practices. And she had changed the trajectory of her entire life through one courageous decision made in a restaurant 3 years ago. The office was quiet on this particular morning. Tanya sat at her desk reviewing case files. The Institute had grown far beyond what anyone had expected. What had started as Richard's personal project to address the fraud in his own company had evolved into a comprehensive program that trained over 5,000 business leaders per year. The program focused on teaching people how to recognize the warning signs of systematic fraud. Tanya had designed much of the curriculum based on her own experience, the subtle ways that Gregory had manipulated Richard, the patterns of embezzlement, the psychological manipulation of trusted relationships. Her phone rang. It was Richard Chambers. "Tanya, did you get the invitation?" Richard asked. "I did," Tanya replied. "I'm planning to attend." The event was a national conference on business ethics being held at a luxury hotel in downtown Miami. Richard had been invited to speak about his experience. Tanya had been invited to speak about recognizing fraud in real time. And most significantly, David Phillips, Patricia Washington, and James Rodriguez had all been invited to speak about their experiences as victims of fraud and their paths to recovery and redemption. The conference was well attended. Over 200 business leaders, professors, and students gathered to hear presentations about fraud prevention, ethical leadership, and creating cultures of accountability. Richard spoke first. He talked about his arrogance and his blindness. He talked about how his willingness to trust Gregory without question had enabled systemic fraud. He talked about the people who had been destroyed by his negligence. And he talked about the long journey toward understanding his own complicity and rebuilding himself as a leader who prioritized ethics over profit. "The most important lesson I learned," Richard said, "came from the most unlikely source. It came from a waitress who had every reason to let me suffer. It came from someone who had been wronged by people like me her entire life, and who chose to do the right thing anyway. Her name is Tanya Brooks. And she's about to share her story." Tanya took the stage. She was nervous. She had given presentations to business classes and to institute staff, but she had never spoken to a crowd this large about her personal story. She told them about her mother. She described what it had been like to be 12 years old and suddenly responsible for her younger brother. She explained how she had worked as a waitress to support herself and Marcus while attending college. She described the moment when she recognized Gregory Hayes in the restaurant. She talked about the choice she faced: expose the fraud or let Richard suffer the consequences he arguably deserved. "I made the choice to expose the fraud," Tanya said, her voice steady and clear. "Not because Richard deserved to be saved. Not because I felt compassion for a billionaire losing his empire. I made the choice because I realized something important. Accountability isn't about revenge. Accountability is about creating systems where people can't hurt other people without facing consequences. And if I had stayed silent, Gregory would have gotten away with stealing Richard's remaining assets. He would have continued to feel successful. He would have continued to believe that his crimes were justified. But more importantly, justice for my mother required accountability for Gregory. And accountability for Gregory required exposing his fraud. The audience listened in complete silence. What I didn't expect, Tanya continued, was that my action would lead to the exposure of a much larger pattern of fraud. What I didn't anticipate was that by speaking up, I would give courage to other victims to speak up as well. And what I never imagined was that my choice that night in a restaurant would lead to my career and my calling. She described her work at the Institute. She explained how she helped train business leaders to recognize fraud. She talked about the importance of creating environments where junior employees felt safe reporting suspicious activity. She emphasized the need for transparency and accountability at all levels of organization. The message I want to leave you with is this, Tanya said as her presentation concluded. If you see something wrong in your organization, speak up. You might lose your job. You might face retaliation. You might be dismissed or ignored. But you might also be the person who prevents systematic fraud. You might be the person who saves someone's life. And you might be the person who changes everything. The response to Tanya's speech was overwhelming. Business leaders approached her afterward asking for advice about potential fraud in their organizations. Students asked about careers in fraud investigation. Colleagues asked about her methodology and her approach. But the most meaningful moment came when an older woman approached her after the presentation. The woman was crying. "My name is Barbara Washington," the woman said. "I'm James Rodriguez's mother. My son was fired for espionage he didn't commit. It destroyed his life. It took him years to recover. And I want you to know that what you did, what you said today, that helped me understand that the shame he felt wasn't his to carry. The shame belongs to the people who created the system that allowed fraud. And you're working to change that system. Thank you for that." Tanya embraced the woman and they held each other, two people brought together by the ripple effects of one person's choice to do the right thing. That evening, Richard invited Tanya to dinner at a private restaurant in Wynwood. It was not luminous. Richard had never returned to that restaurant, and Tanya had left her job there once she accepted the position at the Institute. But it was in the same neighborhood, a place of memories and transformation. "I wanted to talk to you about the next phase of the Institute," Richard said as they ordered dinner. "We've been approached by the federal government. They want to contract with us to design and implement training programs across multiple federal agencies. They want to focus on fraud detection in government spending, defense contracting, and federal procurement." Richard explained the details. The contract would be massive. The Institute would expand significantly, and it would require leadership that understood both the business and the ethical dimensions of the work. "I want you to be my partner," Richard said. "Not just as Director of Investigations, but as co-director of the entire Institute. I want you to help lead this organization. I want your voice and your values to be embedded in everything we do." Tanya considered the offer. A year ago, she would have said no. A year ago, she would have believed that partnering with Richard was a betrayal of her mother's memory. But she had come to understand something important. Genuine accountability and transformation were more powerful than revenge. And Richard had demonstrated genuine transformation. "I'll do it," Tanya said. "On one condition." "What's that?" Richard asked. "We create a specific program focused on investigating and preventing fraud in non-profit organizations that serve vulnerable populations. We create a program that helps organizations working with low-income people, displaced people, and communities of color identify and prevent the kind of systematic fraud that enables corruption of their missions." Richard smiled. "That's a good condition. That's a worthy condition. We'll do it." 2 years later, the Margaret Brooks Center for Ethical Governance opened its doors in downtown Miami. The center was a collaborative initiative between the Chambers Institute and multiple non-profit organizations. Its mission was to train non-profit leaders on fraud prevention and to provide free consulting services to organizations that suspected they had fraud in their systems. Tanya served as the executive director of the center. Marcus, who had graduated from college and was now pursuing a master's degree in non-profit management, served as the director of programs. The opening ceremony was attended by hundreds of people. Representatives from the organizations that had partnered with the center, employees of nonprofits across Miami, government officials, and most importantly, the families of people who had been harmed by fraud and mismanagement in nonprofit organizations. At the center of the ceremony was a memorial plaque. It read, "The Margaret Brooks Center for Ethical Governance is dedicated to the memory of Margaret Brooks, who lost her life as a result of workplace fraud and injustice. This center exists to prevent other families from experiencing similar loss. We are committed to creating systems of accountability that protect vulnerable people and ensure that the mission of serving others is never compromised by greed or corruption." Tanya stood in front of the plaque and felt her mother's presence. She felt the weight of the journey that had brought her to this moment. She felt the responsibility of carrying forward her mother's legacy through work that honored her memory. And she felt gratitude. Gratitude for Richard's transformation. Gratitude for James Mitchell's intervention. Gratitude for the federal investigators who had taken her seriously. Gratitude for her own courage that night in the restaurant. 5 years after Tanya discovered the hidden clause in the bankruptcy papers, Gregory Hayes was released from federal prison. He had served his sentence completely. He had participated in prison educational programs. He had undergone psychological treatment. And he had spent years in isolation, forced to confront what he had done. He requested a meeting with Tanya. They met in a small office, neutral territory, with a federal probation officer present. Gregory was 63 years old. He looked like a broken man. The bitterness and rage that had driven him for so many years had been replaced by something that looked like genuine remorse. "I don't expect forgiveness," Gregory said immediately. "I don't expect anything from you. I'm here because I have something to say, and I need you to hear it." Tanya listened. "I spent 10 years planning my revenge against Richard," Gregory said. "I spent another decade committing fraud. And I spent 5 years in prison thinking about what I had done. About Margaret Brooks. About David Phillips. About Patricia Washington. About all the people I destroyed because I couldn't accept my own mediocrity. And I realized something in prison. Revenge never actually fixes anything. It only creates more victims. And I created more victims every single day that I went on." Gregory's voice broke. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. But I want you to know that I understand, finally, what I did to your mother. I understand that my actions ended a life. I understand that my lies created a chain of suffering that affected you and your brother for your entire childhoods. And I want you to know that I'm sorry. Not performatively. Not to reduce my sentence or improve my reputation. But genuinely. I'm profoundly sorry." Tanya didn't respond immediately. She let the silence sit between them. "What will you do now?" she asked finally. "I'm going to live a quiet life," Gregory said. "I'm not going to try to rebuild a career. I'm not going to try to reclaim respectability. I'm going to live simply and intentionally, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life understanding what drove me to do what I did. And maybe, if I'm lucky, I'll understand something that could prevent someone else from becoming who I became." Gregory stood to leave. "Thank you for meeting with me. Thank you for letting me speak. And thank you for being the person who finally stopped me." When Gregory left, Tanya sat alone in the office. She thought about her mother. She thought about the waitress she had been, serving rich people who didn't see her. She thought about the choice she had made that night in the restaurant. She thought about the transformation that had followed. And she understood something. This was the story she needed to tell. This was the story that needed to be shared. Not as a story of personal triumph, but as a story about systemic change. A story about how one person's choice to do the right thing could create ripples that transformed an entire system. She opened her laptop and began to write. She wrote about her mother. She wrote about Gregory's fraud. She wrote about Richard's transformation. She wrote about the importance of speaking up. She wrote about the power of accountability. The book she wrote became a bestseller. It was assigned in business schools across the country. It was required reading in ethics courses. It became a case study in how fraud happens and how it can be prevented. But most importantly, it became a testimony to her mother's life and death. It became a way of honoring Margaret Brooks' memory by transforming her tragedy into something that could prevent other tragedies. If this story touched you, leave a comment sharing the lesson you learned, subscribe for more, and turn on notifications. I pray for peace, hope, and blessings to fill your day.